Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and I want to start out by saying Happy New Year to everyone.
Happy New Year, everyone.
I hope everyone had a good holiday and a safe and enjoyable new year. We are ready to dive right back into it with social anxiety. And so I teased in our last episode that we were going to kind of tie this heavily into overanalyzing. So I want to start off by posing that question. What causes us to overanalyze? Why do we do that?
I think it's about anxiety. And so we've talked about anxiety before. So general anxiety, not just social anxiety. That often with anxiety, what we're trying to do is gain control over a situation. And one of the ways that we can gain control is to spin and spin and spin until I don't know if we're trying to find an answer or trying to find the best solution. And so the overanalyzing is, I think, a way to calm, although I don't know that it does a good job, to calm our anxiety generally. Give me an example of something where you may have overanalyzed. Do you have one?
Sure. I mean, there's been times where I've been in a social situation and I'll play back a conversation over and over and over in my head and think about the way someone responded. And then I will think about all the different ways I could have responded, all the ways I wish I would have responded.
Well, see, in that case, I think what you're trying to do in some ways is to avoid the same situation in the future. Because what you're doing is you're setting up, here's what happened. I was uncomfortable with that happened. The problem is, here's all the universe of possible responses that I could give in the future. And so I think it's a way to gain control so that you don't fall into that same situation in the future.
Okay, so I've got another example that I think is pretty relatable to people, and that's when you overanalyze maybe a project or you put too much thought into it. Because I've had people tell me, and not too often, but I've had people say, you're putting way too much thought into this. And so you are overdoing it, or maybe you might call it, I guess, micromanaging a project, or you're overthinking it. You're putting too much thought in it. It's this really simple thing, and you are way overthinking it.
So I think it's very similar to what we just talked about, slightly different in that I think with many things, there's always this idea of there's a right way and a wrong way. When for much of life, there are probably many different right ways and many different wrong ways. But I think we get stuck on this idea there's only one right way. And so I'm going to spin and I'm going to overanalyze it so that I get to the right way. And so I think it's that desire when really you have to be able to give up or to acknowledge, okay, this particular project that I'm overanalyzing, it could be good in a number of different ways.
Yes.
Which is typically the case with most projects. And so I think that's it. It's this desire to be right or to have the right outcome.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that because there's been times where when I've done that, it's usually a project that involves a lot of people. And so I want it to go well. I want it to be successful. I want people to have fun. I want them to enjoy themselves. And so I'll overthink it. And sometimes you can do too much when really just a small amount will do. And you can still have a good outcome, but you're so focused on putting in so much effort to make it exactly the way you want that you can lose the joy of the process.
Right. But if you go back to look at the words you just used, that's about controlling the situation. You want people to have fun. You want to have a good outcome. And so there are all these things that you're trying to micromanage. And so the spinning is because if you think about a project, say with a group, it seems like there's so many different variables, right? And so it's like your brain is trying to figure out, okay, there are all these variables. How am I going to fit all these variables together to get an optimal outcome? And I think, again, I think that's what you're after.
And so I'm going to jump ahead for a minute and say a good way to combat that or to kind of help ease that anxiety is just to acknowledge and accept that you can't control other people. You can't control their reactions. You can't control if they have a good time or not. You can only control what you do. And so, I think it can kind of tie a little bit back into last week when it comes to that motivation and what we talked about balance. So, the dopamine versus the
Right.
serotonin,
Serotonin.
right? So that dopamine is going to drive us to do. But
Right.
if we let our dopamine drive us too much, then you're not going to have time to enjoy the process.
I think you're right. I think that's it exactly. And so I've heard this said that there are kind of two types of people, those who are going for perfection and those who are going for it's good enough.
Yep.
And so I think that if you're one of those people who are trying to get perfection or the perfect group project or the perfect outcome, then the problem is that's an unachievable goal, I think.
Yeah.
And you're going to spin. You're going to overthink it. You're going to overanalyze it because you keep trying to get to that perfect result.
Yeah.
Where for those of us, and I think I fall into this category, if we think about things as, well, this is good enough. This project with these people, we can have a good time. We can come up with a good result. And if it's good enough, then you aren't going to overanalyze it. I mean, you're still going to think about it and you're going to have a process, but you probably aren't going to overanalyze it in the same way that a perfectionist would.
Right. Or, you can always say, I can try again. I think instead of striving for perfection, strive for improvement. Right. So, I mean, let's say you love hosting parties. So just, I don't know, take what went well and incorporate it into another one. And if something didn't work, then just don't use it again and say, well, I tried that and it didn't work. So trial and error, and just be okay with the results and don't beat yourself up or try to change the result because you can't. It's already happened. Just look forward to the next project, to the next event, to what can I do better next time?
Right. And it doesn't always have to be what can I do better? Because, see, in that case, it's almost like that dopamine is taking over, whereas the serotonin would be, wow, that was fun. That was good. Let's do that again. And whatever it was that we did was good enough. And as we talked about last week, I think it's important to strike a balance between those two, because you don't ever want to get to a place where you say, well, I don't need to do anything to improve or make it better. I think that is an important part of life. I just think there's a balance in there that we should strive for, and a lot of people don't have.
Yeah. So let's get into social anxiety and kind of what causes social anxiety. Now, some kids tend to just be generally anxious, and I've seen some kids just don't enjoy social interaction. But all kids need social interaction. So I would guess that maybe sometimes social anxiety can stem from poor social interaction as a kid, or maybe a lot of negative interaction socially as a kid. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so I think that, as we said before, most things psychological and emotional are a combination of nature, which is genetics,
Yep.
and nurture, which involves parenting, it involves experiences, and what I call social learning. And so there's almost always a combination of those. Now, in some of the current research, we're getting really good at actually pulling out genes and figuring out, well, this gene has something to do with this. And there's actually a specific genetic marker for social anxiety that people have found. And what it is it's involved in the transport of serotonin. So, serotonin is, again, as we've talked about, one of the things it does is can help soothe nerves and stabilize moods. It's when we're happy and content. But what they found is both shortages and excesses of serotonin have been linked to social anxiety symptoms. So people with social anxiety, what the thinking is that they struggle to produce serotonin consistently and without fluctuation. So there can be a biological component. I think as far as the nurture component, I think parenting, I've said this before, probably in our episode around anxiety, that I think, and in fact, this with anxiety in general, this was supported by what is called a twin study, where they're looking at twins who were separated, and it happened in one of the Nordic countries. That what they found out is that anxiety in general is learned. Okay. And so if you're seeing a parent who has social anxiety, you're going to pick that up. But it's very subtle, the way social anxiety is learned, because say you're around a parent and you go to a social event with the parent, and the kid is going to pick up that the parent's uncomfortable. And so even though you don't talk about it, it's going to be conveyed to the child, there's something scary about this, or there's something scary that I need to be worried about. And so if that's consistent, which if you have a parent who's socially anxious, then I think it's very likely that that's going to be transferred to, the children. I actually have this with a couple of my grandchildren because their father happens to be incredibly socially anxious. And so I think in this case, it's a learned behavior, but also experiences are important, which is what you mentioned. I think the one that comes to mind most readily would be bullying. And so for those people who are bullied, for those kids who are bullied consistently, I think it's pretty likely that they're going to develop some sort of social anxiety, because it's always within a social situation that you experience that bullying. But also, let's say you're at a piano recital and you mess up the piano and then you get made fun of. A one-time event isn't going to create social anxiety, but if you have those types of experiences on a more regular basis, then I think it's pretty likely that you'll develop social anxiety. So it's that combination of nature and nurture.
And so I want to insert in here right now a caveat that we often add is, parents, please don't guilt trip yourself if you are a socially anxious person, because for one, it was either a learned behavior, most likely, or two, as a result of a trauma. Be kind to yourself. And it's okay. You can work through it. You can help your kids work through it. And, don't put all of the blame on yourself, because first of all, if you're a parent who is concerned about passing on social anxiety to your kid, it probably means that you're a good parent and you care about your kid. And if you're trying your best, you're doing enough.
Be kind to yourself, but also I think it's important to know there is treatment for that. And that it can be better for you, because whether or not you pass it on to your child, I think adults themselves who have social anxiety, it's really hard because it's limiting in their interaction, often in the workplace and certainly socially, becomes very difficult to go out and have connections with other people. And so, the risk is that you tend to isolate.
And I think everybody has a little bit of social anxiety to an extent. And I think that's a good thing. So we've talked about all emotions being valid, and feeling anxious is an emotion. And emotions are important because they're trying to tell us something. So I think when we feel that little bit of social anxiety, it's our mind's way of trying to protect itself. It's our mind's way of saying, don't do something to embarrass yourself.
Right. Because we're all aware that on some level, we're being judged, either by what we do, what we say. It's just, do we let that affect us in an extreme way? And so, again, as we've said before, that a lot of these issues, when we talk about mental health or emotional health, exist on a continuum. And, so you're right. Most of us are probably at one end of the continuum where, we're, a little bit anxious and aware and concerned about what people might think about us. But then at the other end of the continuum is someone who is so concerned about it that they don't leave their homes, that they become isolated. Let me give some symptoms of social anxiety, signs and symptoms. And again, here's the caveat that we often give, is that just because you have one of these does not mean you have social anxiety.
Yes.
But, these are things to be aware of. Fear in situations in which you might be judged negatively. Worry about embarrassing or humiliating yourself. See, now that's something, and who doesn't worry about that?
Oh, yeah.
I worry about that. I do. Who would want that? Nobody wants to be embarrassed or humiliate yourself.
I mean, already both of those are things that everybody can relate to. But when it becomes a problem is it affecting your quality of life?
Right. That's it. Exactly. So this is different. This is intense fear of interacting and talking with strangers. Now, that's something that for most of us, we don't have. But for a lot of people, that is a very real fear. Fear that others will notice that you look anxious, fear of physical symptoms that may cause embarrassment, like blushing, sweating, trembling. People notice you, having a shaky voice, avoidance of doing things or speaking to people out of fear, and avoidance of situations where you might be the center of attention. Now, I think that, we haven't talked about being an introvert or an extrovert in this episode, but being an introvert or an extrovert is, I think it's one of those things that we are born with. So, you're an introvert or an extrovert. And so introverts generally are not happy being the center of attention. They'd rather not be the center of attention. Anxiety and anticipation of an event. Speaking, I think it's one of the questions you asked in the outline, is certainly fear of public speaking is certainly going to fall into that category of social anxiety. And then another subset would be performance anxiety. So let's say in fact, who was it? I think for some reason, I remember Barbara Streisand, I think, who has this, such a beautiful voice, right? But I'm pretty sure I'm right when I'm remembering she has a lot of performance anxiety. And so even though she's so gifted, she gets up on a stage and she's dealing with that performance anxiety.
Yeah.
I think even now in this late stage of her career. So performance anxiety is also one of those things that a lot of us have. We don't want to mess up our performance. We don't want to be judged. But it depends on how much we let that bother us.
Yeah. And we've talked about the fact that anxiety, again, is a valid emotion, and there's a reason for anxiety. And often that little bit of anxiety is going to push us to prepare. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's important, right? And so, like we talked about time and time again, it's that balance. You need to find that balance of, I feel just anxious enough that I need to study for this test, but not so anxious that I'm too stressed to study for this test, right? It's about that balance.
It's that curve and I wish we had a video I could show it, but it's that curve that as your stress goes up, or as your anxiety goes up, your performance increases because of what you just said.
Yep.
Because the anxiety is forcing you to either prepare or study. But then your anxiety hits a point where it becomes maladaptive and you crash. And you aren't being productive or successful in whatever it is you're doing. So you're right, it's that balance. You want to have some anxiety, you want to have some social anxiety, I think a little bit, because it leads you probably to behave in a different way. That's, given the situation, it's probably better to be aware of how you're behaving. But then if it's too intense, if that fear is too intense, then you end up not even going to the event, or you end up standing in the corner of the event. And that's when people notice you, is that guy over there standing in the corner.
Doing nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Why is he avoiding everybody? Whereas, if you're kind of just there and you're a little bit engaged, but you're not the center of attention, it's balanced, right? I mean, you can still be present, you can enjoy yourself, you can have a good time, and you can avoid being the center of attention. I think you can achieve a happy medium. And so one of the reasons why I think it's good to talk about social anxiety is because as human beings, we are social creatures. We need and we crave social interaction. And so this ties into introverts versus extroverts. And the way this has been explained to me before is everybody has a cup that you might call their social cup that needs filled. Some people, their social cup is very, very small. Other people, it seems to be an ocean that you could never fill. And so extroverts tend more towards that ocean. It's very hard to get that fill. Like you feel like you could spend all your time doing social events. I fall into that category. I love socializing. I could spend almost forever in a social event just talking to people. Curtis tends more towards an introvert. And even introverts, they still have a need for socialization. Their cup just fills up a lot quicker. And Curtis's cup fills up a lot quicker than mine does. And so in terms of relationships, that's something to be very aware of.
And I think it's important for listeners to understand that being an introvert or an extrovert is not a binary, meaning you're this or that. Again, there's a continuum on there. And, certainly there are people who fall more to the end of the continuum of being an introvert. And then there are more who fall to the end of the continuum of being an extrovert. But also important to realize being an introvert is not the same at all as having social anxiety.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so being an introvert, they are really happier in smaller groups. And so I like, that visualization of how your cup is filled up. It certainly happens more quickly with an introvert, but also mostly introverts are happier with smaller groups, one or two people. And so it's not that they don't want or need the connection. They do. It's just that extroverts are more comfortable in that larger social setting, and being with people, having that connection is so important to them.
Yeah. And as someone who is a huge extrovert, even I have time where I'm like, I don't feel like peopling today. I
Mhm.
just don't feel like doing people, right? Or
Is
I'm
that what you
done with,
call it? Peopling?
yeah, I don't want to people
The
anymore.
people.
Like I'm done with the humans. We all need time to decompress and time to ourselves. And, I think someone who suffers from social anxiety, they probably really cherish the times they get to themselves. And introverts certainly need that. I mean, and again, not that all introverts are or have social anxiety, but I don't know of many extroverts that have social anxiety. I don't know. Is that a thing? Can an extrovert
Um,
have social anxiety?
no, I think you're probably right. But again, I want to make the distinction that I
Yes.
think if the introvert is wanting to be alone, that what is driving that, I think, is very different than the person who is socially anxious
Mm-hmm.
wanting to be alone. And
Yes.
so it's that an introvert, maybe the best way to say it is say, I don't know if it's feeling overwhelmed. That may not be the right word, but their cup is full and they don't need anything more. Whereas I think the person who's socially anxious who wants to be alone is doing it so they aren't afraid. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
way they calm the anxiety, which is
Yeah.
very different than the introvert.
And so again, I guess kind of why I bring this up is because just because your spouse doesn't want to go out and be social doesn't mean they have social anxiety. It may
Right.
mean they need time to recharge. And
Yeah.
that's very important to introverts. And that's
Right.
something I've learned. They need time to themselves to just kind of recharge their batteries. It's so soothing to them. Whereas me, I mean, I like a little bit of time to myself, but eventually I want to go say hi to people, right?
Yeah. And I think that in society, generally, that introverts aren't looked upon as highly as extroverts. And there's a great book. I don't know, I can't remember the author, but the book is called Quiet. That's all it is, Quiet. And it's a fairly short book, but I really like it. It's written by an introvert. I think she's an attorney. And I think she does a really good job of pointing out all the positives of being an introvert. And so there are a lot of positives about being an introvert. So,
Oh yeah.
if you're a listener and maybe you think you're an introvert or you may be partnered with an introvert, there are a lot of positives. That book might be helpful for you to read.
And I think you need to find a balance. So
Mhm.
Curtis and I have a really good balance because he understands that as an extrovert, I need time to socialize. I
Yeah.
understand that as an introvert, he's going to get burned out more quickly than I do. And so, we just kind of have to check in with each other. And so I don't impede too much onto his downtime, his me time. And he lets me go out and socialize with my friends without I mean, he encourages that in me instead of wanting to hold me back. And so I think it's about balance. So
Yeah.
let's go back to social anxiety and let's talk about it among kids and teens.
In what way do you want to talk about it? Like, how do you treat it or how does it come about? Because I think it comes about in a very similar way. Either you're seeing it from a
Yes.
parental figure, you're experiencing it from them, or you've had some negative experiences.
So when it comes to kids and teens, I guess a good way to talk about it is how to help combat social anxiety. And so the number one thing you can do is as a parent is to one, be aware that you have social anxiety and just do your best to try to be comfortable. And if you think about it, it really is learned from infancy. When babies first start being social, or I think it's around 4 months when they start to socialize and interact with other people. So if I'm a stranger and I talk to a baby, the very first thing that baby is going to do is they're going to look to mom or dad.
Mhm.
And what they're doing is they're looking for assurance. Is this okay? Is it okay for me to talk to this person? How do I need to react? And so, I think you can start at a very young age with your babies of, just try to be friendly and you don't have to gush happiness and sunshine and rainbows. Just smile at your baby and encourage them. Let them know, let them indicate being social is okay.
Right. And here's one of the hard things about teens is that teens are in that phase of life when they're going to be hypersensitive to being judged anyway, because they're trying to figure out who they are and where they fit in the culture and in that group. Now, I think that I'm going to say this again, and this for parents. I think social media is really damaging teen self-esteem. And again, if you want some more information, the Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma is really important for parents to watch. But I think that one of the problems with social media is when everybody portrays themselves as perfect.
Yep.
It's really hard when you're looking at it to keep that in mind. Although I think, most teens realize that the photos are going to be photoshopped, they're going to be manipulated. But in that stage of life, you're going to be comparing yourself to others. And if you don't measure up, then I think that has the potential of creating that social anxiety. Because then why would I want to go to a party if in my mind, because I've looked at social media, I'm not going to measure up to what the expectations are. And so I think that the difficult thing about social media is it has really unreasonable expectations.
Yep.
For people in general, but I think especially teens are, pretty impacted by that.
Right. And, I don't know that teens always do immediately know, or I don't think it comes naturally to them to intuitively say, oh, wow, that girl looks so pretty. I think they're going to ask themselves, what can I do to look like that? Instead of looking at that picture and saying, how much work had to go into that? How much photoshopping? How much of it is lighting? How much of it is cosmetic?
Right. And so the problem is, and I think you're right, that they're going to say, what do I need to do to look like that? And not realizing that look is unattainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or that body is unattainable because it's fake.
Yeah.
And so I think the potential for creating that social anxiety is pretty high. And so I'm a real advocate of either no social media or at least limiting social media. I do not think it's good for people at all.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and we know that there can be positives to social media. And so, again, anyone who limits their time on social media, it's only going to help. Like, I mean, I promise you, if you consume a lot of social media, you need to find a better balance.
Right. But teens are going to be drawn to that.
Yes.
I think they are drawn to that. And so it is addictive. It's set up to be addictive.
Yes.
And so, if your teen has unfettered access to a phone or a computer where there's social media, the chance of them being addicted to that is pretty high. And the chance of them being influenced by all these fake things that they're seeing is pretty high.
Yeah. So limit them and talk to them about it. And I think it's good to talk to them in general about all of the pressure that the world puts on people to be beautiful and to be picture perfect. So Lindy and I talked a lot about this in a really good episode called Body Image. And if you want to go back and look at that episode, it's from April of 22. And we really go into this idea of helping teenagers to understand how much Photoshop and how much cosmetic and how much is artificial about what you're seeing in the media. What you see is not realistic. It's not real life. And that's not attainable. And maybe for a very slim margin it is, but what did they have to do to get there? Right. And so you need to focus more about kind of, I guess, what we talked about last week is, that dopamine versus that serotonin. It's okay to be motivated to look nice. It feels good to look nice.
Right.
But how much effort are we putting into ourselves every day? Right? We need to put some effort, but we can overdo it.
That's true. But also there are some things that you cannot change.
Exactly.
It used to be mostly focused on females and how females look, but that isn't true anymore.
Yeah.
And so one of the things with males is height. And so being tall is, for some reason, really desired. now. And so if you're shorter, there's nothing you can do about that. And so, you've set yourself up for feeling bad about yourself because of that. You
Yeah.
can't change it. And I'm not tall. I think I saw a young man who was an adolescent, and that was the issue, is he was short. And there's nothing he could do about it. But he himself had a negative impression of himself because he was short, but only because of what he'd seen.
And so, maybe people are starting to ask themselves, well, what in the world does this have to do with social anxiety? Well, it has a lot to do. These are how social anxieties can start,
Yeah.
right? I mean, because if you're spending all of your time comparing yourself to things around you, you're not going to be satisfied, and you're going to constantly feel like you're not good enough. That's going to cause anxiety. It's going to cause depression. And so I think what we can do as parents is to help build self-esteem, teach kids that my worth comes in my actions. My worth comes from the fact that I'm a kind person, or, that I work hard to achieve my goals, right? And, I can still be a good person if I don't look like this model that I'm seeing on TV. That has no value on who I am as a person. I am more important than my looks. And that's something pretty simple that parents can do, is kind of like, again, we keep going back to last week of, encouraging them to work hard, teaching them the value of hard work, right? Instead of just focusing on, oh, wow, you look so pretty today, or, you look so pretty in that outfit. Say, I like the way that you color coordinate that outfit, or, I like the designs that you picked out.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about treatment for social anxiety. What do you do when you have it?
So I think it's important for listeners to understand that there is treatment available. And so the two main types would be the one which I think is more effective, cognitive behavioral therapy. And so cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, you might hear it referenced that way. It's about changing the negative thought patterns that you have, and then also changing your behavior. Now, as a part of that, I've mentioned this before, systematic desensitization. And so for instance, with a social anxiety, you want, and this is true for any fear, right? That you want to increase your exposure to the fear in short enough amounts that you can stay calm. And so there are certainly therapists out there who are experienced at doing that systematic desensitization. And often it's done in the office, because you can imagine these things. A good therapist can take you through a process where, you imagine yourself taking these increases to be, say, more socially active. And usually you'd have a heart rate monitor on, and you can watch your heart rate go up.
Yep.
And then what you're doing is, before you go, increase whatever it is you're thinking about, you calm yourself down. And so you're always learning to calm yourself down in the process of getting more and more, say, socially exposed. Now, so you can do that in the therapist's office. That can also be done out in the world, and some therapists will certainly do that with you. I think I've only ever done that one time, and that was years ago. We went up on campus to the University of Utah because and there was some social anxiety. And so you actually go out, and then therapists can help you to stay calm as your heart rate starts to go up. Then the other option, so in addition to psychotherapy, the other option is certainly a medical doctor, a psychiatrist is going to say, some sort of medication. And what they're going to be is the SSRIs. Now, I don't know that I've ever had a client who was on SSRIs and had social anxiety who said that it helped. I tend to be skeptical about it. That doesn't mean it might not help you. I think if you're considering, some type of medication for this, it's important to talk to, I don't know that a general practitioner, an internist, has enough experience to really talk about medications in this way. And so I think a psychiatrist would be better. My preference, that I've mentioned before, APRNs, at least in Utah, they're called APRNs, Advanced Practice Registered Nurses. And I think they're much easier to talk about. They have all the training that you would need. And also, at least in the state of Utah, they are licensed to provide therapy as well. And so there are a lot of APRNs who will prescribe the medications, and they also provide the therapy. So I think if you're thinking about medication route, I think APRNs are a really good option. So those are the treatments, and I think both are effective. Now, a lot of people are going to say that it's the combination of the two that make it effective, which I think research tends to point that way, that psychotherapy plus the medication gets pretty good outcomes.
And, maybe even just going out with a friend who you can trust, a friend who's going to nudge you in the right direction, but not push you too far.
And that's you're doing your own systematic desensitization, essentially, with someone that you trust. I agree. I mean, that is certainly a reasonable option.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So next week, we are going to get into sensory processing. I think this is going to be a really interesting topic because I know we're hearing more and more these days about a thing called sensory processing disorder. So we're going to talk about that. And we're also just going to talk about the fact that people have sensory needs in general. And we'll get into what that is.
Have a good week, everyone.
We will see y'all next week. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.